provided. They will be deposited at our archive at the Wellcome as a resource for scholars. And for those of you who haven't been to an interview before, I thought it might be of interest to know the thinking behind the series. First, we wanted to visit what has been a turbulent period in the history of British psychoanalysis. And we've asked the interviewers, all senior analysts, to reflect, sometime at least, on their memories of that period and the part they have played in it. But because the interviews are unstructured, each one is different from the other one, this has not produced a coherent history of British psychoanalysis. But we would claim that the material at its best has flavor, liveliness, and a charm which gives us a glimpse into analytic life which is not available elsewhere. For example, where else could we learn that members, as Marie Sandler told us, that members of the Anna Freud Center described the Tavistock, which was at that time in Fitzroy Avenue, as within spitting distance.
As spitting distance.
Secondly, the questions one can put to a practicing analyst are severely restricted by her profession. I don't know what will happen in this interview this morning, which hasn't yet taken place, but I can guarantee that there will be no sex and no sin. As Lacan put it, the analyst pays for the analysis by the sacrifice of its subjectivity. Finally, we have called the series Being a British Psychoanalyst in the expectation that the interviews would give us not a chronicle of events, but something of the context, the flavour of what it is to practice psychoanalysis in Britain today. Now, many years ago, Irma Pick was very kind to me when I was in some distress. And when I mentioned the incident to her recently, she said she had no memory of it. I suspect that her life was strewn with good deeds, which she cannot now remember, and that she has a heart of gold. As an analyst,
I wouldn't count on that.
As an analyst, she is a Kleinian, Kleinian through and through, I can say. And her many interesting papers include a study of adolescence. After all, we're not just adults and children. There's a time between with its own distinctive characteristics. She's worked like all analysts on countertransference with its complexities and its shifting nature. And she's, her most recent work is a contribution to a book called Envy and Gratitude Revisited, in which she's linked, or I might say reconnected really, envy and jealousy together with guilt in a vicious circle. Now, as a sociologist, I was particularly interested in an observation she made. I think this is in the paper on envy and gratitude. If there is a mouth that seeks a breast as an inborn potential, there is, I believe, a psychological equivalent. That is, a state of mind which seeks another state of mind. In other words, man is a social animal and society is natural to man. Now, Michael Brearley has also been very interested in where the analyst should place himself in a session in relation to the patient, and he's at the moment engaged on a long article on what he calls neutrality. He's also recently taken up office as president of the British Psychoanalytical Society. But to any right-minded person, in this country at least, these activities are of very small account, insignificant, I would say, altogether negligible in comparison with the important fact that he plays cricket and he has written a book on the art of captaincy.
thank you for asking us, and here we are. And I think we could start at the beginning, really. Your childhood, South Africa, the 30s.
Right, before we do that, maybe the beginning is here. I mean, in the sense, it's a very unusual situation to be, it made me realize how much we protect ourselves by, when we talk in public, in a way, sitting behind our patients, actually, or maybe even hiding behind our patients. And so, part of what we're used to is not revealing ourselves too much. So it's quite interesting, what is the effect, and in a way I'm interested also in what are you hoping for from this? What is one being invited to? And it does feel partly a seduction, because of course it's so nice to think people would like to know where you come from and actually listen to who you are. At the same time, of course, there's always the question, well, what is the interest in who you are? How much is it a friendly curiosity? And how much do all sorts of other things come into it? So it's been quite a challenge, in a way, just thinking about, here I am, no patient, it's me. Okay, so here I am. So
it's what Audrey touched on with the sacrifice of subjectivity, isn't it?
Right.
How much? And I wonder whether to start off talking about that straight away too, because one of the things in your paper on countertransference and some of the other papers is your emphasis that although you rely on technique, you have to account for and take in extremely powerful feelings and recognise them and deal with them and work on them. So although there's a certain sense of sacrifice of subjectivity, in another sense it's only through the subjectivity that you can understand the patient or help the patient.
Right.
So,
but I think also when you say you have to, the trouble is one can't always.
One tries to.
One tries to. And I think this is the difficulty. Where do we come from? And in a way, what strengths does that give us? Whatever is the journey we've taken and whatever it is we've survived, and what vulnerabilities does it leave us with, including blind spots or what we don't want to look at and so on. But I think it is crucial. It seems to me it is always that interaction of how can you use your countertransference to help understand the patient better, and what is your countertransference that is your stuff that you never fully work through. And there is the problem. Yeah.
Well.
So, okay, so
your journey.
My journey. South Africa and apartheid South Africa, which you were, of course, reminding me of. Born in 1934, so just before the war, not very long before the war, into a family. My father came from Russia, spoke with a strong Russian Jewish accent. My mother had come from also from Russia, but she had been in England. She was born in England, arrived in South Africa when she was 6 months old, and used to speak of England as home. Maybe it had a deep truth, but it was also the pretensions of, the expats, the British colonials who spoke of home and what everybody wanted to identify with. So everything British was good, actually. One spoke of imported goods as with a special aura. But it was a very restricted family in the sense, both restricted, poor, no books around, struggling in a way for survival, a little better by the time I came on the scene, but also restricted in no imagination really about what was going on in the world outside, and little imagination and little place in the struggle for survival about how people really felt. So, either within the family, I think, or within the community.
Or within you.
or in me, indeed. And somehow I was the one who found this very difficult. I was much the youngest in what was a very big family. And it's difficult to know, you start on your story, how boring one can get about. You have to shout. I went in to see, there was some years ago, we South Africans thought we would do people a favour, and we organised a conference on psychoanalysis back in South Africa, thinking we would take something back to the new South Africa. Anyway, they were outraged by this in general, and who did we think we were, and where were we when all these terrible things were going on? But anyway, a man called David Sachs, who was very posh, very important to them member, had come from America, IPA, in charge of new societies. So if they wanted to develop, he was the man they needed. Anyway, at the back of the room, suddenly, in the middle of his boring lecture on tolerance, a young black woman from the back of the room said, "I'm so-and-so, and I'm bored out of my mind, and I'm going." At which point, somebody else got up from the front of the room and said, "And I am so-and-so from Golders Green, and I'm bored out of my mind too." So, anyway.
Feel
So
free.
you are free when it gets too much for you. Where was I? Yes, my mother's mother had died when my mother was 15, and she was the oldest of 6 children, the youngest of whom was 2 months old. She married my father when she was 17, and he was 12 years older. And they brought up her siblings, actually. So it was a huge family where I had 3 unmarried aunts living in the family. My sister, 10 years older than me, was actually closer in age to my youngest aunt than to me. So there were a lot of people around and a lot of struggle for survival. And my father was ill. My mother really carried the family, and, terrific matriarch, actually. And so a lot of goodness and goodwill, but really very little place for, as I said, for how anybody felt. And I don't suppose there'd been much place for how they had felt as children either, actually. And I found this extraordinarily difficult, and I was the difficult child, and why could I not be like this older sister? So my mother eventually held the family together, first by learning shorthand and typing, and then teaching it, and eventually building up a big college. And by the time I came on the scene, there was this big college, and my sister was secretary to the college, and my brother was destined to become an accountant, and it was all fine. Yeah, and it wasn't fine for me, actually, and they didn't find me fine either. So it was a very difficult place to grow up, really. And in that, also in a kind of Jewish ghetto, and the only non-Jewish people I met were at school, but they were somehow another. So there was another kind of apartheid that went on. And in my mother's staff, she had teachers on her staff, but we really lived in a tiny, tiny community with black people known only as servants, really, and this was unquestioned. I have to say, with shame, also by me. I mean, one just grew up, and that was how it was. And I had also the misfortune, to add to what I experienced as my misfortunes, to have white nannies. By now my mother, she had made it a bit and felt very guilty about how many hours she worked. So to provide me with something better, instead of a black nanny, which I think might have been much more congenial, I had a Mrs. Evans, who was a Christian Scientist widow from Tasmania. I mean, strange, displaced people who... Anyway, so it was an odd life.
But your difficulty found some expression through books and thinking and ideas at a certain time.
That came much later,
later.
actually. I mean, the books, I did read quite a bit as a child, but nobody ever to talk with about what I was reading, and fairly restricted, you know. Little Women was the best I got. And no ambitions either. And in fact, my one ambition throughout childhood was to be a nursery school teacher. And I think I found great comfort in looking after and being with little children, younger. And I actually went, and so that's where I was headed. And I remember going with my mother to the interview to the Teachers Training College, and the head of this college who interviewed me said this girl should be going to university, which had not been on anybody's horizon.
So at that stage you'd have been about 15 or 16?
At age 16.
16.
One matriculated very young. I was at boarding. My father died when I was 12, and I was sent to boarding school because there was now nobody else around at home. And I managed eventually to come out of my whatever and started to do a bit well, not marvellously. Anyway, I did well in matric. And so this lady, who I don't even remember her name, kind of changed my life, actually. And it was a real sea change, because it was a different world suddenly. So in Johannesburg, apartheid, the University of Witwatersrand, can't say it anymore, and Cape Town were the two universities which weren't segregated. And so for the first time in my life, there were black students. I mean, I met black people alongside me rather than serving me. You know, and it's a very remarkable change. And also teachers who invited you to think about these things. And actually, I was so naive that I came home thinking my mother, who was not a bad, just hadn't had an education and didn't know about these. So I came home with the news. And it didn't go down very well, actually. My first experience of real resistance to taking in anything new. I mean, a feeling of outrage, really, and of me wanting to upset. And so more difficulty. I then became, in a way, gradually more estranged from all this family, who now found me completely impossible. You know, and really not out of evil, just it would have upset them. You see, I thought, but they don't realize. They're very concerned about what happened to the Jews in Germany. I mean, the war had been by now, and the Holocaust. They don't realize this is the same. And they thought I didn't realize this was not the same. These were not people. It was something else. So it's, you know, we were in for
These
difficult
were not people,
times.
meaning...
Pardon?
Who was not people?
Black people.
Yeah, I thought that's what you
I mean, you couldn't put it alongside in any way what had happened to the Jews, because there it happened to people, and here it happened to I don't know what. You know, terrible. I mean, profoundly shocking, and profoundly unthought. I mean, and no place for thinking.
And the degree you did was in social sciences?
The degree, that's right. So not nursery school teaching. What was I to do then? I had no idea. I somewhere did know I was looking for something.
Yes.
So anyway, social science seemed to be about people. And so it was a degree in social science, so-called psychology, sociology, and social work, poor, really. The psychology was mostly running rats through maze. So a terrible disappointment, because I was somewhere looking for something that would understand me. And it certainly wasn't there. It began to be there a bit in the social, you know. I mean, I began to learn about what was going on in South Africa. So that was highly illuminating.
Yeah. And you started to read, about that time you started to read.
And started to read
Yeah.
a bit. The first essay I had to do at university, I got 8% for, with lines through it. Sociology it was, red lines. What makes you say this? What makes you think this? What is your evidence? And I had no idea about going to books, to a library. I think it was on alcoholism or something, and I came out with all the cliches in the world. But I actually hadn't had the experience in my lousy school in the heart of Afrikaner apartheid to know about going to reference books. So I was really pretty raw. So, and then at the end of that first year, I was given the opportunity to come on a student tour from South Africa. 140 of us racing around Europe. I think we did about 10 countries in 3 weeks. Something like that. And, but anyway, I came back and met my first husband, Abe Peck, who was, so I was then about just 18, and he was 9 years older, so he was 27 about. He was a doctor. He was in some kind of therapy, in analysis, on his way to, so this was 1952, on his way to train in England in psychoanalysis. And he was in the Young Communist League, which by now was banned, but had been. So I met him and Marx and Freud all on that first evening with him, you know, which really changed my whole life. I hadn't met either Marx or Freud at university, I have to say, yet. So that was a kind of totally life-changing experience, and I fell in love with the lot, actually.
Altogether.
Altogether. Well, you know, he waited for me eventually. He had to wait another 3 years for me to finish my degree. But it was as though this was what I was looking for, both in him, but also psychoanalysis. But somebody talking to me about understanding how I felt was such a kind of revelation, really. So I came to it very young, actually.
And so he was waiting for you to go to England, to come to London.
He was always going in 6 months' time, because he was on his way when I met him.
Yes, I see.
And I needed to get my degree, because without that I was going to be totally, you know, stranded. Yeah. So in the end, I completed my degree at the end of 54, by which time I had got involved and then disengaged from South African politics. Not disengaged emotionally, but it was a very frightening time, actually. I mean, it was a pretty brutal government, and I don't know how much do you want to hear about South African politics. Anyway, I stood, I think that year, maybe it was the next year, anyway, to be on the Student Representative Council of our university, and together with 2 others, Charles Bloomberg and Ismail Mohammed, who eventually became the Attorney General in the new South Africa. And we stood on a ticket. We were for academic freedom, which is absolutely right. But I remember Ishmael saying, and we had to do these speeches, the others are weaklings, we're prepared to stand up for what we believe in, and we're prepared to hang for it. I remember holding on to my neck, thinking, hadn't actually contracted for this. But anyway, I make a joke about it, but it wasn't funny at the time. Anyway, I got elected with him, and I remained there for a while, but I then began to get phone calls recruiting me from people at the Indian National Congress and the African National Congress, and I got very angry with them because if I was going to be any use to them, it would be as somebody who wasn't known. We knew that all phones were tapped. By then it was apps. And so I felt I was being pulled into something and really compromised in a very dangerous way. And either I really was prepared to dedicate, and I mean, in a way, maybe that would have been a braver course to anyway. People I knew did and spent many years in prison and so on. But it was a moment of terrible choice, actually, that you either followed that road, and it was a pretty serious road, and I felt deeply committed to it, and at the same time not ready to dedicate my life to it, or you had to get out. And I got out.
I mean, it sounds as though you got out towards something rather more than from escaping from. So I suppose it was both, but it was really
both.
To something as well.
It was. I mean, so we then came to England at the beginning of 55. I kind of knew we wouldn't go back, actually. My late husband thought to go back. Anyway, so I felt I was escaping, the enormous relief to get out of there. Also because you lived in such a guilty way if you weren't doing something about it. It was a very difficult place to be. Not that one achieved much by getting out, but, for them, but anyway. I thought we wouldn't. I didn't want to go back, but it was also to something. It was to train.
And you were treading a path that quite a lot of other people had taken and would take.
Well, there was yes. I mean, Abe had come to psychoanalysis because there had been before a man called Wolf Sachs who wrote a book called Black Hamlet, and who was also, I don't know if he was a communist anyway, left-wing socialist, and he'd had a few walks or talks with Freud. He was it. And he was clearly an inspiration to many people, and a number of people of an older generation had already left, I think in 48. So by the time we came to England, there a lot of South African analysts here, and there have been an enormous number. I mean, there would have been a huge community if we'd all gone back. Only we didn't. So there were a number.
And did you know some of these people before you left? I mean, some of the people, or who were the people who...
No, I mean, we came... in our pockets. My mother wouldn't support this project. I mean, she by then would have been in she thought it was outrageous and mad. What was I doing marrying a poor boy, which, I mean, he came from a very, really poor family. By this time, my family was a cut above that. But also this thing called psychoanalysis, where was I? So we came with that, really knowing one or two people. The main one who became very important was somebody who's just died, actually, in Australia eventually, called Sam Stein, who came from the same town I did, and I sort of knew his family, and who had been a medical student with Abe. And Sam was working at the Tavistock Clinic. And our first meeting, the day after we arrived, was with Sam in a grotty little children's playroom in the old Tavistock Clinic in Beaumont Street. And Sam's journey, he was a doctor, psychiatrist. He was well in his training, had started with a contemporary Freudian, moved to Lois Munro, who then was a Kleinian, who had complicated idea, so pushed us in the Kleinian direction. We knew nothing about groups. I mean, we'd come to do psychoanalysis. We'd heard the name of Melanie Klein. We'd just heard the name, but had really no idea about anything. Anyway, Sam educated us in a kind of extraordinary way because he was pushing us Kleinian, because that was the move he made, but he had all sorts of caveats. and you didn't go to Rosenfeld because he was too intellectual, and you didn't go to Bion because he was a rugby player, and you particularly didn't go to Hans Thorner because he was a super Kleinian, whatever. Anyway, so there were all kinds of, and we were terribly ignorant. I mean, I was 21, and there was Sam, our mentor. Somehow somebody we met, I can't remember who it was, and I'd had a bit of, so I then had a bit of therapy in South Africa too, before I came from somebody, wasn't Anders, but trained at the Tavistock. He gave me some introductions to the Tavistock. They wouldn't talk to me, too young. Yeah. Somebody then pointed me to Anna Freud. So we're now July 1955. So I had an interview late, almost the end of term, with Anna Freud upstairs in the Freud house, and she was enormously taken with my name, Pick, and my name Irma, and I must be German, and my first class degree by now I came armed with, and she was prepared to have me, more or less like that, which left me feeling a bit discomforted because I wasn't who she thought I was, and she didn't know me anyway. So I got kind of accepted by her, except she said I would need to go see a couple of other people. Anyway, time went on, and I did see a couple of other people, by which time Abe was doing a lot of reading. It wasn't just WhatsApp, but he was very taken with Kleinian ideas. And I wasn't properly reading at that point.